Do you need the microphone?
I have this. All right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Megan Imundo. Megan is originally from Chicago, so this cold weather is not scaring you, right?
No.
She did her undergrad degree at Northwestern University, working with David Rapp, where you also worked as a lab manager.
Mm-hmm.
And now she's completing her PhD at UCLA, working in the Learning and Forgetting Lab with the Bjorks, where you're also the lab manager.
Well,
right?
like not officially, but I run a bunch of the meetings.
Yeah. Megan does she's been amazingly productive as a grad student. She does amazing research looking at kind of understanding the mechanisms of learning, but also she has interest in applying this to educational settings. And she's also actually here interviewing for a postdoc position to be supervised by Faria and me. And I was telling Megan, I got another annoying email from Bob Bjork yesterday telling me how amazing Megan is. So, I mean, that's really high praise. And Megan's also training for a marathon.
Yeah.
Right, in the middle of everything.
Yeah.
All right, so I will pass it on to Megan.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I know there's a bunch of you up here, so I'm gonna occasionally try to make eye contact, even if you're in the back. So sorry if you were trying to avoid eye contact by sitting there. So today I'm going to be talking about a lot of kind of the last year of my research work, which has been focused on taking tests in groups in the classroom context and looking at how this testing might enhance memory for course content. So, just like Joe said, I just want to kind of broaden out and talk a little bit about my broader research program. So my research really focuses on 4 different things, all really rooted in theories of learning and memory from a psychological perspective. So I've had the pleasure of doing research on best classroom practices, desirable difficulties, learning in online contexts, and the ways in which we learn with and from each other. And that's really given me the opportunity to do a lot of different things within the intersections of these different facets of research. And so I'm really excited today to talk about the center, what I see as the center of these facets, which is my collaborative testing work that we did in a large SIM course at UCLA. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on group testing, collaborative testing. I'm going to talk about the processes elicited by collaborative testing, potentially both good and bad for memory. I'm going to describe features of good collaboration and how we leverage those features of good collaboration in our own research designs. I'm going to go through experiment 1, where we measured long-term retention of course content using a surprise retention test. And then I'll talk about experiment 2, where we looked at long-term retention using questions on the course final exam. And then depending on if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about the ongoing research we have and kind of some of the results that are coming out of that I'm really excited about. So, first and foremost, why do we study testing? Well, testing is a very, very powerful learning strategy. Many of you in this room probably do testing research. Testing benefits learning relative to restudy. We often call this the testing effect. It's one of the most powerful learning techniques currently identified. And what's great about testing is it often can be incorporated into existing course structures quite easily and can be combined with other effective learning strategies to really boost learning in the classroom. So why then would we study collaborative testing, aka group testing, where folks are in a group putting their heads together to retrieve information? Well, there's a common saying, 2 heads are better than 1. You might have heard that once or twice. And so you might go, well, we know 2 heads are better than 1, right? Putting a bunch of people with different pieces of information together in a room and having them recall information is probably going to lead to better performance than one person sitting by themselves and retrieving information. And the literature says, yes, that's exactly correct. Groups tend to outperform individuals on tests, which is why often this is only the initial test. Instead, what we're interested in our studies and in kind of this broader literature, is if you then take someone who took a group initial test and then later at, let's say, a 3-day delay, a 1-week delay, put them in a room by themselves and had them retrieve some information, do they do better than that person that was by themselves at the beginning and is by themselves again for that individual final retention test? So that's really what we are looking at when I'm talking about the benefits of collaborative testing. So the previous work on collaborative testing has largely been in the context of high-stakes STEM courses, often in these kind of disciplinary specific research journals. Gilly and Clarkston 2014 is kind of considered the gold standard of classroom design for what we call 2-stage high-stakes exams. And they did their work in a medium-sized, in-person STEM course. And so gold standard meaning that they control for the number of tests, and they also have some kind of delayed individual retention measure. So what Gilly and Clarkston did is they had students come in and they took an individual midterm exam. Again, very, very high stakes, a big part of their final course grade. And then immediately after that exam, they had students break out and first retest on a portion of the exam individually. And then, if that wasn't enough for these students, they had them get into groups and retest as a group on a different portion of that original individual midterm exam. So that's kind of the 2 stages, really in this kind of a 2A, 2B kind of stage way that they did their exam. So this was session 1, individual midterm exam, individual retest on some of the questions, group retest on the other questions. And this was on a Friday. Students then went and they had, a nice maybe nap, restful weekend. Maybe they went to a party. This was pre-pandemic, right? They come back on Monday, 72 hours later, surprise. They were surprised with a final individual retention test. If they had not been tested enough, they were really tested by that point. So they come in, they do a surprise final individual retention test. What do the results show? On the x-axis, I have midterm 1 and midterm 2. They did 2 midterms with the same design, some counterbalancing and whatnot, so I'm presenting them together. And then on the y-axis, we have what they call normalized change from midterm exam to retention test. This is just a fancy word of saying, hey, if you were getting a 90% on the individual midterm exam, you only have 10% to kind of move overall on your performance, whereas if you got a 70% on that original midterm exam, there's a lot more room for movement. So we did a mathematical formula to kind of correct and essentially look at real increase versus potential increase, taking into account that initial performance. So what do we see? So for questions that were retested as a group, students on that individual final retention test do far better than for the questions that they retested on individually. So we see this really, really nice positive effect of collaborative testing after this high stakes exam. But, oh, okay. Oh, it's my hair. The luscious locks, what are you gonna do? Okay, so the broader literature, unfortunately, is much more mixed, which is unfortunate, but also kind of exciting. So sometimes classroom-based collaborative testing can enhance memory for content at a delay. Other times, not so much. We don't see any benefit beyond an individual retest. So what might be going on here? Why might there be mixed results? Well, I'm going to go into a few cognitive processes that could be elicited by these activities that have some positive and maybe some negative impacts on later learning. So put yourself in this scenario. You're running a study, you have participants come in, and you task them with memorizing the following word list. There are a bunch of items on this word list. We're going to use fruit examples just for ease of talking about this. let's say they have 20 or 30 items that they have to learn, and there's, some fruit mixed into that list. So you have folks first do some kind of individual study. You can think about this as like individual test preparation. And then you have them get together and do a collaborative test. You give them a sheet of paper, you say, as a group, write out all that you can remember together, right? Come to a consensus on your answers, write them out. We want to see how much you can remember. And then you bring them back in the lab, let's say 48 hours later, 72 hours later, and you say, okay, now it's an individual retention test. You each get your own pieces of paper. You each have to independently write out all that you can remember. So one beneficial process that might happen during that group collaborative practice test is re-exposure. So a group member says, hey, I remember apple, and that essentially serves as a re-study opportunity for the other group members, right? They essentially get to re-study the item apple. There's also the phenomenon of cross-cueing, right? So someone says, I remember apple. That serves as a cue for another group member to go, ah, yes, that reminds me that I remember the item orange from the list. And then finally, there's error pruning, right? Someone says, I remember banana, and another group member disagrees, kind of calls them out, and prunes that error, says, actually, I don't remember banana. We shouldn't put that on the list. And that way, it kind of stops that error from carrying over on that later final individual retention test. There are also some processes that might occur that are not so great for individual memory. So retrieval disruption, someone's saying, oh, I remember, and they're kind of on their own path down a certain retrieval kind of segment, and then someone kind of goes, hang on, wasn't orange on the list, and really disrupts their flow of thinking and prevents them from remembering what they were going to remember. There's also production blocking. This can look a couple different ways, but in this example, let's say you're trying to be a good group member, you're trying to engage in turn taking, so you're not just blurting out answers like, the last time, and you go, okay, I remember watermelon, but it's not my turn, so I'm gonna wait, I'm gonna hold that in my working memory until it's my turn to speak. But while you're doing that, you're losing out on the ability to kind of keep searching your memory for additional items, so that can block additional items from being produced. And then finally, social contagion errors. So just like you can have error pruning, someone can say, hey, I remember banana. Maybe they say it so confidently that the other group members go, yeah, I think I remember banana too. That sounds right. Let's put it on the list. And then those group members, again, contagion, that's become a really common word post-pandemic. And again, it spreads from group member to group member onto their own later individual tests. So these are some cognitive processes that might be, elicited or not elicited, that might lead to some of those mixed effects that we potentially see in the classroom. There's also a lot of non-cognitive processes that might matter as well. So discomfort with group work is one. Whether people see the value in testing, or what are their kind of anxieties or hangups about testing coming into the testing situation. Their desire for community, either within their classroom or with their lab group. And then the group dynamics. Is there one person really dominating the group? Are group members withdrawn? They're not really participating in the conversation. They're not knowledge sharing with the group. Those might matter as well. So in our work, we were really thinking about how can we maximize potentially beneficial processes and reduce potential harmful processes during our collaborative testing activity. And we really came to look at Johnson, Johnson, and Smith's 5 features of good collaboration as a good framework for what to focus on in trying to achieve this outcome. So what are these 5 features of good collaboration? First, there's positive interdependence. So this is when individual and group success are linked. This can look like having joint rewards, where kind of the group gets rewarded as a whole. It can also look like complementary roles. Maybe you use this in your own teaching. Someone in the group is assigned to be a facilitator. Someone in the group is assigned to be the group reporter, reporting out for whole class discussion. That's a great example of complementary roles. There's also individual accountability. So this is when performance of each student is assessed at some point. Individual final retention tests, especially if they know it's coming, is a great way to foster individual accountability, as is something like a participation grade or peer evaluation of your group members. There's promotive interaction, so that's when students promote one another's success. Often we think of this as like deeply engaging with one another in a positive way. So offering explanations, not just saying this is the right answer, let's move on, right? Really offering explanations and justifications of reasoning and challenging each other's answers, again, in a positive, supportive way. The fourth feature is appropriate use of social skills, so fostering constructive interactions. This can look like following good principles of communication, as well as effectively dealing with conflict. And then finally, there's group processing. So this is when groups are actually working together to identify ways to improve their group process. So this can look like collective decision-making on a change in the group behavior, and also error-proofing, so eliminating an inappropriate action or something that just isn't working for the group in terms of what their long-term goals are. So in the current studies, there's going to be 2 of them. These were all done online via Zoom. This was during kind of the height of emergency online instruction, so everything here was in some ways online. We did it in 2 sections, about 250 to 300 students each, of introductory psychology at UCLA. Content was primarily delivered using asynchronous lecture modules that used recorded videos, little activities, little question prompts that they did each week. And then we also coupled that with synchronous laboratory sessions via Zoom that happened for 2 hours each week, and that was with the whole class together in a Zoom room supported by a bunch of undergraduate learning assistants, graduate TAs, and the instruction team. So here, we wanted to examine the potential of practice testing rather than doing something after a high-stakes exam. And our reasoning was that, one, this might be a better way to kind of get students to deeply engage with one another in a productive way. So there's less pressure to be right because this is really just for a participation grade, not for a grade on a high-stakes exam that people might be more likely to want to like dominate, right? And be like, no, this is the right answer. I have to get an A in this class to get into med school. We are not changing this answer. So there might be more discussion. The material's less well learned. So there's greater opportunity for group members to actually share knowledge with one another that maybe another group member doesn't know. They're not kind of maxed out on how much they've prepared or studied that content yet. And so we think collaborative practice might be especially beneficial to learning when you kind of have more of a practice formative stage of learning activity rather than following a high stakes exam. And then we also made the decision to use multiple choice practice tests. So the reason we chose multiple choice was that it is really helpful in kind of guiding retrieval, kind of putting everyone on the same page in terms of what they're thinking about. It offers a nice structure for discussion, right? There's 5 options and you have to choose one of them. So it sets up these really clear expectations for what that goal of the discussion should be. And they may be less susceptible, therefore, to some of the harmful cognitive processes that are sometimes found, especially in lab-based studies, when you have a more open-ended retrieval task. And then finally, to facilitate good collaboration, prior to the labs, prior to the lab that the practice testing activity occurred, we had groups engage in either these kind of neutral group activities, or we developed some group building section activities to hopefully foster more group cohesion. I'll offer some examples of those in a moment. So experiment 1, what was the overall design? So between students, between sections, you were either in the neutral section or you were in the group building section. So that was our between participants design. And then within each section, you did, if you were a student, you did a collaborative test, and then you did an individual test. So students participated in both the collaborative condition and the individual condition, regardless of section. So in experiment 1, this was done again, height of pandemic learning in fall 2020. In labs 1 through 4, students in their sections either did neutral activities or group building activities. And then lab 5 was the practice testing activity that happened about like week 7 of the quarter. We're on the quarter systems, which are 10 weeks. So this is kind of on the later side of the quarter. Then a week after the activity, there was a surprise individual retention test that was embedded into their asynchronous lecture module. And then again, they were surprised now 2 weeks after the activity with another surprise individual retention test, again embedded into their lecture modules. So when I'm saying neutral and group building, what do I mean? So neutral was something like, hey, identify techniques that you could use to be more productive during lab sessions. Like maybe click out of some of those social media browsers that you probably have up on your internet right now. So generally a good thing to kind of get students to think about, not really meant to, produce better group work. Whereas, for example, this was meant to facilitate promotive interaction. We had lab groups get together and we gave them a list of sample constructive group behaviors they might engage in. And they were told, okay, each of you identify a constructive group behavior that you want to use, and then discuss your chosen behavior with the rest of your group. Kind of compare and kind of see how you can all work better together. So lab 5, again, was the practice testing activity. There were 4 multiple choice tests on 4 different topics. So for example, biological psychology, learning, very standard curriculum for an introductory psychology course. Corrective feedback was provided at the end of each practice test. So they did get to see the right answer, what they got right and wrong at the end of each practice test. So for 4 topics, they did 2 collaboratively, and then they did 2 individually right after. So here's an example question. All of them were set up this way, where it was multiple choice. It was 5 options. 1 option was the correct answer. We never did all of the above or none of the above or anything like that. It was always just one of these options. So which of these statements best describes the cerebellum? And then there's some, especially for intro psych at this point, like some relatively complex answer options that we hoped would facilitate some complex discussion with group members. It wouldn't just kind of jump out, right? We also added in confidence judgments as a measure of metacognition. So what happened was after each question, students, again, either individually or as a group, depending on the stage in the session, bet points after answering the question. So they saw the question, they answered it, then they bet some points. So you're told, how many points do you want this to be worth? Again, we told them this is all for fun, this is just to keep things interesting, right? This is not part of your grade. And they were given the option to put between 0 and 3 points. Now, if they got the question right, they kind of earned, right, those points that they bet. Otherwise, they lost the points that they bet. Since there were 10 questions per practice test, there was a possible score of either -30 if you were super, super off your game, or +30 if you were really, really on it and also knew the material really well. And we were interested in looking at this because, again, we're looking at practice testing. So the presumption is they're going to go on after this and continue to study for their exam. So we were curious, since confidence can inform students' later study decisions, whether there would be an effect of more accurate confidence when they're in a group versus individually as a result of the group discussion. Okay, so again, for the retention tests, we took items directly from the practice testing activity because we're really interested in specifically memory and course content. So 4 were previously practiced collaboratively and 4 were previously practiced individually for each retention test. So each retention test included a different set of questions. So there were 8 on retention test 1, 8 on retention test 2, no overlap between those questions. And again, these were embedded in the asynchronous lecture modules according to the week that they were assigned. All right, so let's get to the results. On the x-axis, I have neutral or group building section. Light blue bars are going to be questions. These are practice tests that they did individually, or dark blue is collaboratively. Proportion correct is on the y-axis. So we're looking first at practice test performance, how they did in lab 5 with that activity. And unsurprisingly, as you can see, in accordance to a lot of other literature, when you put a bunch of students together, they do better than when they're by themselves. So we see this nice main effect of practice test format, but what we don't see is any format by section interaction. So in other words, the difference between individual score and collaborative score in the neutral section was not significantly different than the difference in individual and collaborative test scores in the group building activities. So the section that did group building activities didn't really seem to get like an extra collaborative boost the way that we were hoping. Now looking at BEP points earned, this is our measure of metacognition, again, during the practice testing activity. So y-axis is BEP points earned for both the neutral and the group building activity. We see, again, a nice effect of taking tests in groups. And so you see a big benefit to those collaborative practice tests in terms of kind of alignment of actual performance and metacognitive judgments. And here we do see an interaction. So it's not huge, but it does seem like compared to the neutral section, there is a bigger difference between individual and group practice testing in terms of BEP points earned in that group building section. So again, not huge, but that is significant. So now looking at our key DV, we're looking at individual retention test performance. Again, this was done on their own whenever they kind of happened to do the individual modules. So looking across at both retention test 1 for the neutral section, retention test 2 for the group building, or retention 1 for the group building session, and then also for retention 2, there's this small but consistent positive effect of practice test format, where across both retention test 1 and 2, and across the different sections, there's about a 3 to 4% performance bump on these retention tests. Again, even though they've all received corrective feedback at the end of the practice testing activity. So yeah, we don't see any interactions or anything, just that one main effect. So looking at experiment 1, overall we see this nice benefit of collaboration at both practice and at both retention tests. Students' confidence was more accurate, more kind of aligned when collaborating, when working alone. This might help students later on after the activity make more informed study choices if they accurately leverage that calibrated confidence. And then there were kind of inconsistent effects of the group building activity. It seems like maybe there was a bit of an effect of the activities in the group building section in terms of confidence, but we didn't see any kind of performance differences based on the activity. So in experiment 2, we really wanted to bump up the strength of those group building exercises to really put to the test, like, can we get more cohesive or more effective group work? So first thing we did, we went back to Johnson et al.'s framework. We really went in and tried to more calibrate our exercises to facilitate those features of good collaboration. We also changed it so that all activities were completed on the same day, the day of the practice testing activity. So rather than kind of spread them out, which might be good for other reasons, we thought, okay, well, let's just do like a really strengthened manipulation on the day that they're actually going to do the key group work. So an example of one of the changes we made, this was one of the bigger changes we made to try to facilitate a little bit more positive interdependence in groups. For that group building section, they were told before they broke out into their groups that, hey, at the end of the lab, we're all going to come back to the main Zoom room, and we're going to give you some questions about topics that were covered on the group rounds. And if 90% or more of you answer these questions correctly, then the entire class is going to get a participation point for their lab. And for those of you who are teaching right now, you know that students are so into their participation points. They will do so much to get a participation point, especially if it's kind of framed as like an extra bonus kind of thing. So we were like, maybe this will be really motivating. So we told them, okay, so then it's really important that you all work together during the first 2 review rounds and make sure that all of your group members really know why you chose the answer you do. They're really engaged and kind of all up to speed because there might be an impact later on if you just kind of leave a group member behind, right? In reality, everyone just got the point. We weren't going to like penalize the class for not doing this. And they like easily met this threshold because it was so immediately after. So this is what we did in winter 2021. We also changed it so that retention was assessed via a course final exam rather than a 1 week and a 2 week delay. We moved some stuff around, so now it was a 6 week delay. So a longer delay and also assessing on a high stakes exam. So longer retention interval. And then we thought it would be nice to see if there was an opportunity to see the educational benefit on like some kind of exam that students really care about and prepare for, right? Do we still see this benefit even when students are doing a lot of preparation ahead of the exam? So we took 4 questions from the practice testing activity, 1 per topic, 2 that were practiced collaboratively, 2 that were previously practiced individually, and again, put those exact questions on that course final exam 6 weeks later. So we're going to go back in time. We're going to look first at the practice testing activity results. So the left panel is test performance. So just overall, how did they do on the practice testing activity in winter 2021? And again, what we see, just like in experiment 1, is this nice replication of the main effect of practice test formats. So groups do better than individuals on the practice testing activity. And just again, even with the strengthened group building exercises, just like in experiment 1, there was a non-significant format by section interaction. The group building exercises didn't seem to give the collaboration side of things any kind of boost. So looking on the right-hand panel now, bet points earned. So again, this is our confidence judgments. This is how we implemented that. Again, just like in experiment 1, we see a nice main effect of practice test format. So you see a boost overall to bet points earned, but we don't this time see a format by section interaction. There's a hint of it, but it's actually in the opposite direction than in experiment 1. So rather than group building seeming to be maybe beneficial, in fact, numerically it's worse, this section. So now looking at final test results, this is again course final exam, high stakes, 6 weeks later. Looking at both the neutral section and the group building section, we don't see any significant effects. No main effects, no interaction. But I do want to draw your attention to one thing, which is that overall there is very, very high performance on these questions. In fact, given kind of pandemic learning concerns and whatnot, we ended up making the final exam open note. So students could actually go back to course materials. And overall, the average exam score was an A overall in that quarter. So that really limits what we can look at. So experiment 2 discussion, again, at practice, we see higher practice test scores, and we see greater alignment and confidence in actual practice test performance. We don't really see any effects of the group building versus the neutral section activities. They just didn't really seem to do much in experiment 2. And there was no long-term retention benefit of collaborative practice testing, again, on this planned high-stakes exam. So one possibility is that these effects don't last for 6 weeks, right? There's maybe it's good for 1 week or 2 weeks, but not for 6 weeks. It might diminish over time. Again, maybe it doesn't hold up when students are engaging in a lot of preparatory strategies. And then it was an open note final exam. We made that decision for some accessibility and equity concerns. And so we had a very, very high average exam grade. So overall, we see that collaborative practice testing enhances retention of course content under certain circumstances, right? Kind of depending on the type of retention, maybe even the timing of the retention test. We didn't really see that the group building exercises were impactful. There's a couple of reasons why this might be the case. One, at this point, when they had been doing this activity, they knew their lab group members fairly well. They had to do a bunch of activities, not only in class, but also out of class with their group members. They designed like their own survey study and had to go out and like collect data and work together to visualize that data, run like a t-test on that data. So they knew, each other fairly well at that point in the quarter. It was also a very highly structured activity. So looking at the role of group building exercises in supporting good collaboration, they're often studied in more open-ended contexts like problem-based learning or like a week-long, semester-long type group project, where maybe with it being more kind of open-ended, that extra cohesion actually makes a really big difference. But when it's highly structured and kind of timed in one session, maybe it doesn't matter as much. There were also really clear time and participation expectations, as well as a ton of TA and instructor support during the activity. So maybe they didn't really need to collaborate as much as we thought. Yeah, and then collaborative practice testing might encourage more accurate confidence judgments than individual practice testing, possibly because when you have to discuss and actually come to a consensus with your group, you're sharing knowledge with one another. Before you put that down, you have a little bit more time spent thinking about the material that might contribute, as well as kind of seeing how many people initially thought that the answer you chose was the right answer, sort of a wisdom of the crowd kind of situation. So there might be more cues available to base your judgment on. So future directions. In this study, we were really focusing kind of just memory, pure kind of direct recall, not necessarily application of learning. So that's the direction we're moving into. Looks like I have about like 5-6 minutes that I'll be able to go a little bit into that. And then also the role of test format in guiding recall of information and kind of structuring group discussion. So that's some of the ongoing research that is sort of dawning, right? It's kind of in progress. We've got some results going that since I have like 5-6 minutes, I'll get to at least preview for you and kind of tell you a little bit about. So rather than multiple choice, we now have a whole line of work looking at collaborative true-false practice testing. And the reason we chose true-false is because, sorry, the hair got in the way again. In introductory psychology, there's these concepts that the instructors have noticed students confuse time and time and time again. So absolute threshold kind of going from, let's say, no sound to, oh, do I hear a sound? Like when you do a hearing test, my students love it when they can all hear that like really high-pitched noise that like the instruction team can't hear, and they get like really, they're like, yes, we're superior on this one thing, right? So, so absolute threshold, so no stimulus versus the presence of a stimulus, whereas different threshold, okay, if I close my eyes and you had a feather to my hand, and I already have some stuff in my hand, can I detect that change in weight, right? Students get these mixed up all the time. Random sampling, I don't know if anyone here is a Harry Potter fan, but when Dumbledore is kind of sampling, Bertie Bott's every flavor of beans, and he kind of just sticks his hand in and chooses one, and it ends up being like a really gross flavor, right? He's engaging in some form of random sampling, right? Sticking your hand in the bag and just happening to see what bean you pull out to sample, good, bad, or otherwise, versus random assignments. So maybe using some kind of random generator, lottery picker, spinning a wheel to put people in different conditions. Students tend to get those mixed up as well. And then things, again, like in biological psychology, hypothalamus versus thalamus, they're both part of the limbic system. They sound really, thalamus, hypothalamus is just thalamus with hypo on it. Like, why do we do this? So there's these concepts that appear over and over again that students just constantly mix up. So we were thinking about how can we support students in learning to differentiate these different terms. So hear me out. I'm going to start with the final test. I'm going to talk about this research first by talking about the final test. So the final test was a cued recall question. It looks something like this. So Joanna is watching a movie with her friend Trent. As she leaves the room to get a snack, she's like, hey, can you turn down the lights? And Trent gets up and turns down the lights as like a good friend should do, right? Rather than being like, why am I being asked to turn on the lights when you're up? But when Joanna comes back with her snack, she goes, oh my gosh, thank you for turning down the lights. I can see that they're dimmer. So the decrease in light meant Joanna's what? So this is a difference, detecting a difference in stimuli. So the directly targeted information here is difference threshold. And then that, again, easily confused concept, we're going to label related information, and that is absolute threshold. So we want students to say difference threshold here, but often that closely related concept is absolute threshold. Okay, now working backwards from final test to practice. So what we did is we had students, again, collaboratively or individually take a true-false practice test. It was very similar to the procedure that I showed you before. And so directly tested at practice was, again, some kind of cover story. This one was about a search and rescue dog. True or false, this is demonstrating Bo's absolute threshold. Oh, wait, hang on. Oh, no, I flipped these. So frustrating. We can splice this out of the live stream, right? Or like the recording. Yeah, I'll like dub it over. It'll be okay. So anyways, sorry. So this should be, so this should be related at practice. Let me show you the related first because now it will make more sense. There's always one mistake in a talk, but that's okay. So, so directly tested at practice, we give them a cover story. We say true or false, this is testing difference threshold. This is a true statement describing something about the directly targeted information that they don't know is going to be targeted yet. Or we could give them the same cover story, but with the false statement. So we sub in absolute threshold instead of difference threshold. Now, we could also give them the related questions. We could test them on the related concept, which is absolute threshold, and that could be a true statement or that could be a false statement, right? So you kind of get this 2x2 design. So previously in the lab, my colleague Jordan Brabetz has done work on this and has found that there's something called the one and done phenomenon. So when you give people true and false information at practice, true and false statements, and ask them to evaluate it at practice, when the statement is true, they tend to be really good later on at remembering the directly tested information. So you directly test them on difference threshold. They're pretty good at knowing information about difference threshold, not so much about the related concept. It doesn't elicit retrieval of related information. Now, in contrast, there's this really interesting interaction in which when you give people false practice, it elicits retrieval of the related information, kind of like they need to negate, right? They need to retrieve something to negate the false statement, but not so much supporting retrieval or sort of later memory of the targeted information, the later targeted information. So he was like, let's see, I'm at 3:15, I could go 2 minutes. So he was really interested in going, wow, this is a super cool effect. How do we break this? How do we make it so that there's broader retrieval rather than this really, really specialized targeted retrieval? So he added something called competitive clauses to his true-false statements. And they look something like this. It was a lab-based study, so it was different materials, but for simplicity, I'm going to show you kind of what we did in ours, which is modeled on the same. But we had true or false. This is demonstrating Bo's difference threshold, not his absolute threshold. So now both concepts appear, and they're kind of put against each other in this competitive comparison kind of way. And when you do that, it does indeed broaden retrieval. And you see now kind of a benefit at final test for kind of all involved topics. So we went, wow, that's really cool. Can collaboration likewise broaden retrieval and disrupt this one and done phenomenon that Jordan's shown in the lab by kind of changing the format of the materials? So again, I don't have time to go into too many more details. We're kind of drafting this all up, so sneak preview. But what we found, first of all, was that when we did individual practice testing with traditional true-false practice, in the classroom we found the same effect, the same interaction that Jordan found in his lab-based work, which was really exciting to see that this is a finding that does translate from the lab to the classroom. But when we had students now get together and collaboratively practice test, they look very, they look very, very similar to that competitive clause true-false performance that, again, folks in the lab perform. And then just to kind of check it, we ran a competitive clause version of this where we had students get together and do competitive clause true-false practice, and they look like just what they did in the lab. So it's not like suddenly collaborative practice testing is really, really bad. if you're a competitive clause. So you benefit from competitive clause, true-false practice, regardless of whether you do it individually or collaboratively. And again, this is in the classroom, so we're really replicating his lab-based results. But we were able to get a disruption of the one and done phenomenon. Again, kind of find an effect and break it a little bit, find that boundary condition by just having students get together in groups and exchange ideas and share ideas with one another. So I see that I'm at time. I'm really excited to continue this future research. I have a lot of different facets to my research program I'm excited about continuing. We're really thinking about, where asynchronous versus synchronous online and in-person courses, how we can facilitate good collaboration, thinking about how we could maybe record group interactions, really get some real-time recording data, and there's a lot of different ways to think about what that recording could be to really see what are some of the markers of true, authentic collaboration, what are some of the impacts of that for learning, and what kind of needs to happen for that kind of authentic collaboration to occur. So really quickly, before I wrap up, I want to thank hugely my collaborators, Melissa, Courtney, and my advisor, Elizabeth, for all of their work on pandemic research, which many of you know is really challenging sometimes, as well as our kind of lab group that's very similar to the EdCog lab group that we have here, and also our funders for some of this work, APS, Society for Teaching of Learning, and Instructional Improvement Grants from UCLA that allowed a lot of this work to happen. And yeah, this work is under review. Hopefully it goes well, and I can hopefully send out to Joe when things are kind of settled, whatever kind of comes of this research. All right.
Thanks so much, Megan. I know there might be some people that have to leave at 3:20 to go to next class or so. And just a reminder, there is a wine and cheese reception immediately following up on the second floor, and everyone is welcome to join. And open to take some questions. Sigal?
Hi, nice talk. Thank you. I was just wondering if, like individualized medicine, it's possible that there is individualized best learning practices. So that there may be individuals that really benefit from this collaborative testing situation and some that don't. And I wondered if you, with 600 participants, if you have any of those individual traits of those individuals, whether certain personalities or types might learn better in these situations and not others, and you're just sort of getting a wash.
Yeah.
Or not as dramatic effects because you're not taking those traits into consideration.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that this is really important. Some of the in-prep work that is just it's not prime time ready because I'm still building the models is one of the things that we do in IntraPsych is we have a very large pre-course survey where we survey their beliefs about learning, their prior experiences with certain types of courses. We have some registered data, so some demographic information, their high school GPA, and what we're working on next quarter is kind of getting a group together to think about what might be important predictors that kind of moderate, right, this effect of the collaborative benefit. Because again, maybe if you have really high test anxiety, for example, maybe collaborative testing, rather than being kind of a good thing for you, might make you go, oh, everyone's going to think I'm stupid if I put out an answer and I'm not going to really engage. The other thing that we're interested in is naturally these were kind of semi-random groups. They're just kind of whoever they ended up in a breakout room with, and those kind of became their group members from day one that they can kind of continued through the quarter with. And so because of that, we have this interesting, again, it wasn't intentional, but we have some groups that all kind of were similar performers in the class, right? Like based on like quiz scores, they were all kind of maybe similarly high achieving, medium achieving, or maybe a little bit lower achieving. And then we have some groups that were really mixed up, where there was maybe someone who was really kind of knocking it out of the park versus someone who was maybe struggling a little bit more in the course that ended up in a group together. And so one of the things that we plan to look on is there some sense of like, does the homogeneity of the ability level in the group, does that really matter in terms of like coming up with a collaboration benefit or not? So I think that this is a really timely question. I mean, especially with doing something in such a large course, we can't always look at every group and say, okay, is this group member having a good time? What's going on? But at the very least, we can take some of those pre-course individual difference measures as well as some demographic data and some of the group measures and see if there's anything that really stands out as a predictor.
That's a really cool answer. Just from my own personal experience with learning, one thing you may not think about doing with group dynamics that I recommend you do
Yeah.
is look at sex ratios.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Because I know that when learning with a bunch of women, I act very differently than when I'm with mixed sex.
Yeah.
Personally, that's just what I remember from my own university days.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that. That's an interesting thing to look at.
Thank you for a very clear talk. You're obviously a great instructor, I would say.
Thank you.
Go back to your experiment one slide where you had the interaction effect. I want to make sure I'm remembering.
Yes. So this would be there we go. There's a lot of animations, so just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
I noticed that the actual individual scores went down in the group building exercise, both
Yeah.
conditions. And I also noticed that for your last slide, for the true false, the individual scores went down. Do you have any hypotheses or speculative?
So yeah, so went down in terms of
So the interaction effect was caused
Yeah,
by
the group
individual
building.
score going down, not by the yellow bars in this case being different.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if anything jumps out at the top of my head in terms of what could be going on. I know that in experiment 2, one of the challenges we had was time constraints, and so we added all these activities to the day of rather than spreading them out. And one of the consequences of that was like those who participated in what was the winter 2021 activity, there was a little bit more like kind of rushing that we noticed by students. And so I don't know if that's totally going to explain this. The other thing that could be going on, trying to think, might be that one issue we had was because it was a Zoom session, we had all the collaborative session kind of part happen first because it's a lot easier to get people to start out in groups than to put them later on in groups. And one thing that we did notice was a lot of people kind of dipped out of the Zoom room early once they got to the individual session. So we took participation at the start of the class, and so sometimes people ducked out 10, 15 minutes early. It's possible that, again, maybe with the group building, it took a little bit longer to do some of the activities, particularly in experiment 2, and maybe kind of being outside the classroom context and finishing up those individual tests, maybe that kind of messed with their performance or they felt a little rushed. But I think that's a really good observation, and I'll have to kind of stew on it a little bit.
Experiment 2 also, you had, I think, close to a ceiling effect, so you were very difficult to find probably.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, winter 2021 was just a little bit of an odd quarter in a couple different ways.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really, really great talk. Thank you so much for giving it. I had a question about the social contagion stuff that you're talking
Yeah.
about. Like, you talked about how there's both a potential positive effect and a potential negative effect of social contagion.
Mm-hmm.
Do you take any measures of like whether or not individuals engage in group study, whether they switch their original answer after the group, like whether they were convinced by somebody else or not? Like, is there, or is there anything in the literature about whether?
Yeah, so there's a great science paper by, I'm gonna blank on their name. I will try to find it and I'll send it, so it could be sent out. I know that there's one great science paper where they looked at essentially what happens when you individually put in your answer and then you get together as a group, what kind of happens. The results are like you do become more aligned with your group, but what was interesting, one of the results that really is why it was in science, was even when all group members came in with the wrong answer, this was like a really challenging STEM course where performance was generally pretty low on a lot of different activities. Even when all like 3 or 4 of them came in with the wrong answer, often the groups ended up getting the answer right, because what would happen is you come in with your wrong answer based on some kind of misconception or faulty reasoning, and as you're kind of discussing with one another, you start to realize, well, that's faulty because of this, and you're telling me my answer is faulty because of this other reason, and eventually the group kind of figures out like, okay, we've all been wrong for different reasons, and this kind of leads them to the right reasoning and the right answer. So that definitely leads them to change their answer for the better. Yeah, I think that this gets into almost some of like the decision, like the difference between kind of thinking and learning and memory and like decision making and some of the groupthink literature of where, again, coming to a consensus as a group can be a really good thing when the group is right and they're unbiased, they don't hold preconceived kind of judgment problems. But coming to a consensus as a group can also be really fraught, particularly when, let's say on a jury, there's preconceived biases that are shared by all group members. Or in a policy makers meeting when they all ideologically have a very similar bias, right? In that case, then maybe we don't want so much consensus, right? So I don't know if I totally answered your question, but there's definitely evidence that people are very susceptible to peer influences and group influences. And in our context, it ends up being generally a good thing, but there's a lot of literature and applications where maybe that isn't such a good thing.
I was wondering if you take into account whether people study in groups outside of these specialized topics.
Yeah, so that's one of the pre-course measures that I was talking about earlier. That's one of the things that we do ask is like, do you study with friends as part of your kind of study strategies? Because we find that some people are like, I am all about the friend study. We all get our frappuccinos. We all hang out in a coffee shop together. And we have, that's like social time, collaborative time. There are other people I know that are like, I need to be in a quiet room with no noise, with no anything. My mom's like this a lot. And so she's like, office doors closed, I need to sit down, I need to think and need to read. And so we do have pre-course measures on that, and we're really interested in kind of looking at that within the context of this model we're building, because that might be really important, right? How much group experience do you have? And like, do you even like group work, right? Some students like really don't like group work. They get pretty upset when we do this, but they come around. They come around with time.
Right there.
So, great talking again. I'm interested on your opinion, like there's lots of different interventions or strategies you can use that are coming out in EdCog literature
Yeah.
to improve student performance. And I'm just out of touch with the literature as of late, and I'm wondering like how does the effects of collaborative testing that you've measured and seen in literature compare to other types of strategies that people might be implementing with like new modern approaches to classroom learning?
And when you say kind of like new modern, like implement, like can you just give me a specific, so I have something to kind of ground.
Getting students to do a pretest or giving them structured studies or maybe making them use cue cards or like there's lots of different things that people like there's kind of like when you go to the EdCog symposium there's like all sorts of different approaches to improving your classroom
Yeah.
as an instructor and you might say well given my limited resources and time I should probably choose one.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. My kind of immediate answer is I don't really have a sense of like effect sizes, right? This versus that. I think one of the things that made me so intrigued by collaborative testing and kind of these dynamics in general is the opportunity to enhance not only retention of content, but also potentially other student outcomes that might be important. So for example, there's often every like 2 or 3 years you get some kind of New York Times article or some other kind of BBC article that says like, people don't know how to collaborate, right? They're coming into the workforce and they don't know how to work in groups together and manage conflict. And so whether or not I believe or don't believe, right, those types of articles, I think one of the cool things about collaborative testing is the opportunity not only to add in a testing activity in the classroom, which we know testing is good for learning. We really encourage instructors to implement testing in their courses, but there might also be potentially other benefits like increased group work skills, maybe an increased sense of community in the classroom. I didn't present the results here, but we do see pre-course to post-course pretty significant improvements in positive attitudes towards group work, as well as decreased discomfort with group work based on like a validated measure that we did pre-course and post-course. And so those are other potential measures or kind of student outcomes that like might be really important. And I think that's one of the nice things about kind of creating kind of a richer experience other than, and it's still great, other than clicker question, okay, let's do some quick retrieval practice in the middle of lecture. That has a time and place, but I think that there's an opportunity to enhance a variety of outcomes with these kinds of activities.
That's awesome.
one there, and then Pat for our last question.
So just another did you take into account question.
Yeah.
I guess did you take into account like things like how competitive the campus is or children or also something that would probably be in your precursor as a student probably aren't going to answer honestly like how much cheating is going on.
Yeah, those are good questions. We did on the pre-course ask about, in terms of group, like how much community do you want with your group? Like, do you want to really be working together just in the classroom or like outside, like in a social situation? We also asked like how much community did you have in your group after the activity occurred, kind of more towards the end of the quarter. In terms of taking into account campus climate, we didn't specifically in this course because this was all kind of on the same campus climate. But I do think that, you know, UCLA students are great. They are also sometimes really, really intense, right? And they really, really want to do well. You know, they want to get the 99s, the 98s, the like 102s if we offer participation points. And so that's part of why we did more of a practice testing activity that was ungraded, low stakes participation, rather than something that came after a high stakes exam where maybe like honestly emotions are kind of high after a midterm, even if generally the class does well. At least in my experience, students could be kind of hard for them on themselves and kind of intense. And so we did choose a practice testing activity in the hopes that that would kind of ease off the kind of intensity a little bit and let them actually kind of genuinely talk with each other in a more relaxed setting. But it would be interesting to have the opportunity to kind of do some multi-institutional implementations and kind of see across different kinds of campus climates what we kind of see.
You got me thinking, imagine like a scenario where it's for bonus points, but it's a zero-sum game.
Ooh.
The top team in the end will get the bonus points.
It sounds a lot like an engine. I feel like that's like a very engineering course kind of thing where it's like, you know, kind of the design challenges and you're sort of ranked at the end.
Okay, Pat, last question.
You mentioned that there obviously are ceiling effects of students that are getting 95 or higher can't benefit as much. But aside from that, you can exclude them. Do these manipulations change the shape of the distributions? Or if you look at D, C, and D students, does it just shift everybody up?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't looked, well, I probably did at some point, but I've forgotten. I didn't specifically look at the like how the distributions kind of change. I don't know if it's a rising tide lifts all boats thing where everybody just kind of shifts up or if there's any kind of like bimodal things that happen. I will look at that though. That's really an interesting thought.
I'll sneak in one last question.
Yeah.
So with collaborative testing, there's so many different ways to implement it, right? And so we talked about kind of group dynamics, what are the people like, what are the types of questions that you're asking? Are they kind of low level or are they kind of application?
Yeah.
Versus are you using one stage or two stage? Like where people answer first individually and then they get to collaborate. Do you have any intuition on what's the best situation to make collaborative testing the most effective?
Yeah. Oh, so many great questions. So I think that, you know, one of the challenges, and I don't want to go on a whole soapbox here because I know that we're running short on time, is I think one of the challenges with there's a lot of effects in the lab-based work, and your paper that I cited like a bajillion, your review that I cited a bajillion times here, highlights this of, you know, lab dynamics, lab study dynamics, group dynamics in those spaces, there's so many differences than in the classroom. And so I'm really hesitant to say, you know, like Saparna Rajaram, who's done some great work in the lab, has found that if you give people the opportunity to first individually retrieve and kind of solidify their retrieval strategies, that then when they get in the group, they're less susceptible to something like retrieval disruption, and it helps kind of mitigate the negative impact of that process. But I don't know with a multiple choice test where it's really highly cued and structured if you even have to worry about that, right? Because it kind of offers potentially like a really already nicely cued up way of approaching that thought. I don't know.
I think you can make a multiple choice question that's much more applied.
True.
Versus like kind of like surface level recognition.
Yeah, and in that case, I wonder where, maybe what's on that individual test really matters, where maybe individually you test them on definitions, foundational knowledge, and then maybe when they get in groups, then maybe that ends up being better for more, application is more facilitated if maybe solidified, I don't know, before.
So as
But
an
it's,
instructor,
you
when I
know,
do it in class, I use like clickers.
mhm,
The questions that I really try to make are when at the individual level, there might be like some variance. And then when they get together,
yeah,
there's more correction towards the correct answer. But it's still enough that the class gets it wrong where there's like an almost audible gasp when I reveal the correct
Yeah.
answer. And then I think that kind of stimulates like the discussion and the learning and the error correction. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting continued area of research. Thank you so much, and wine and cheese reception right on the second floor. Please join us.
Cool.